so good to have you here, Jacqueline. And just like we heard here before, I think that, I mean, you are and have been for so long such a pioneer within impact investing for 25 years plus. But I wanted to start in that, even though I think that there are a lot of people here who already have you as a role model and a mentor and a friend, but for those that have you as a new friend, could you share something about you personally that will make everyone feel here that, well, I've known Jacqueline for my whole life?
Perfect starting question. Thanks, Sarah. I'm just really happy to be here at Norrsken and just love what Nicholas and you and the team have been able to do in the world. So just thank you to everyone. I think probably to know me is to know I'm the eldest of 7. It's a very boisterous family, and all of us are entrepreneurs. Have a deep belief in entrepreneurship, and yet maybe coming from an immigrant context with a very poor grandmother and grandfather on my father's side, have always held this idea of the power of entrepreneurship, freedom, and striving with a deep sense of duty for the collective. And I think those two have to go hand in hand, and I think that's sort of core to who I am.
Thank you. You've written a wonderful book. You've actually written several books, but Manifesto for a Moral Revolution that I recommend everyone to read. Do you want to share a bit more in summary? What do you mean by a moral revolution, and why do we need one?
Well, so to be clear, I don't mean by moral some book that's handed down with a set of rules that we're supposed to be following. I mean that we have, for a very long time, built systems that put profit at the center of everything. And what this moment of deep interconnectedness, indeed interdependence, requires is a different framework, one that puts our shared humanity and the earth at the center. We've seen technological revolutions and financial revolutions, and now an AI revolution fundamentally shift the world and our systems, much for the good. And yet we also are more unequal, more divided, more fragile in the face of climate change, and more afraid than ever in my lifetime. And that's why I think it's time for a reckoning, a moral reckoning of who we are to each other and the systems that we need to build.
And I suppose that most people, if you ask them, like, would you like to be moral, yes or no? Like, everyone would say, like, yes, of course, I would love to choose the moral path. And I suppose that most people in this room are super committed to that, and at the same time have the daily challenges of that, and then it needs to be cost competitive, and I need to raise this fund, and so forth. Like, how have you been thinking throughout your life and career about that balance between idealism, if you will, and pragmatism of how the world works?
Well, first of all, let me say that I, having worked for 40 years with people that include some of the least privileged on the planet and the most privileged on the planet, I have concluded that most of us, 99.9% of us, yearn to be good. We want to contribute. We try to figure out how to give our children opportunity. We're all the same. When I'm thinking about the kind of systemic moral framework that's required, it's more the recognition that we've essentially had a binary of systems. We've had a market system that really works, except when it doesn't, because it often overlooks the poor or can exploit the poor. Or we've had a charity/aid system, which too often creates dependency. The system that the world needs takes the best of both and tries to reduce the worst. And so rather than saying, either I have this pool of capital and this is how I'm going to spend it, or I'm going to maximize my profit and hope I do some good on the side, it says we have existential problems in the world to solve. 600 million people have no electricity. We have a food systems problem. We have a health crisis. To solve those problems requires starting with the problem and building the right capital stack and the right incentives around that, rather than the other way around, which hasn't so far been successful in solving the problems.
I think you said so beautifully many times that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth, it's dignity. Can you expand a bit more about both what you mean by that and how that has shaped how you have built Acumen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes from Stella, my grandmother, and seeing this notion of choice and of the ability to make our own decisions. And I'm looking at Yi, who is one of my superhero friends over here from Kenya, so I didn't expect her in Barcelona. We invested in Yi's company called FarmWorks a few years ago. And I have a habit of talking to the customers of our companies when we visit them. And FarmWorks essentially works to build both regenerative agricultural practices and systemizes practices so that they can build a much more viable supply chain. And right now, I think you're the biggest domestic supplier of fruits and vegetables in the Kenyan market, really starting from scratch. And so I took two women, Faith and Sara, older women farmers, to the side, and I said, so they tell me here that this company is helping you get out of poverty. Is that true? And Sara, the elder, said, yes, it is true. I used to be in poverty and I'm not now. And I said, well, how did you know that you crossed the poverty line? And she looked at me like I had two heads and said, you don't know when you cross the poverty line. I said, well, you have to help me understand something. And she said, well, it used to be that I would wake up in the morning and I would feel stress. Stress that I wouldn't have enough food to feed my children, stress that I wouldn't be able to send them to school, stress that I couldn't take the bus to get to the market so I could sell my goods and services, my fruits and vegetables, or get back home. And when you're really stressed, you make really bad decisions. And she said, now I wake up in the morning and I feel good. I'm able to make those decisions. And I even bought myself a new dress. And I said, well, what's that feeling, Sara? And she sort of looked at me and she said, I think that feeling is freedom. And I think that that is the universal yearning to me, that she didn't have to wait around for anyone to hand her something. She was, because of the work of this company, she was given the opportunity to solve her own problems and to know that she would have enough to make good on the promise that she wanted to make to her children and to her own life. To me, that's dignity.
Jacqueline, I think a congratulation is also in order for you and for the world that you've recently closed the fund, $250 million, to reach the hardest to reach people with electricity. 70 million people, I understand, is the ambition to reach. Tell us more about this fund and your observation of how it came about and the ambition with it.
Well, sure, thanks. So I should just say that my organization has been doing impact investing since 2001. And we were one of the first to invest in the first off-grid solar company that was operating in Africa in 2007. At the time, 1.5 billion people had no access to electricity. 1.5 billion. These guys had to figure everything out in terms of what it would take to build a market that had never existed for people who, for too many, didn't count. And so we took our philanthropy and we invested patient capital thinking it was a 7 to 10 year run. We've been in the company now 17 years, and while we've exited Series A and Series B, we're still significant investors. Along the way, we started to see that you could actually build a market that hadn't existed and that we were accompanying them. We started investing in them, and then we started to see a nascent ecosystem, and we started to invest across the ecosystem, distribution companies and credit companies and marketing companies and back-end companies. and what we call the adjacent possible, solar irrigation and televisions. And before you knew it, our companies, 40 companies had reached 200 million people with off-grid access to electricity. And so at that point, which was about 5 years ago, the world still had 600 million people with no access to electricity. But we'd come a long way, and we had seen that one nonprofit impact investor, who now has about 600 million in for-profit funds, could really move the needle. And so we said, well, if we're going to reach SDG 7 as a world, let's do the numbers. Because the markets by themselves are going to leave about 300 million people fully out. And so maybe Acumen could come in and show that it's possible to reach the hardest to reach. Those individuals living in 17 of the poorest countries on the planet, all of whom have under a 45% electrification rate. Some, like Burundi, have a 9% electrification rate. Malawi, 16% electrification rate in 2025. And if we are to do that, then what's the right capital stack so that we can both encourage existing companies to go into places like Burundi or Malawi, and so that we can provide the right kind of working capital so that they'll stay and actually make good. And to Sarah's point, last week, we were able to close $250 million. It's quite a radical capital stack. It's 60 million of pure philanthropy that allows us to make investments that nobody else would make where markets don't yet exist. 2 months ago, we made our first loan in Somalia. We're one of the first lenders, if not the first lender, in the nascent off-grid space. We are investing in early-stage companies in Benin and Burkina Faso and Malawi. It is so exciting to see what we felt almost 20 years ago, where people are seeing that they can be part of the solution themselves. Side by side is a $200 million debt fund that has first loss capital from Green Climate Fund and brings increasing commercial capital over that. And then we have a $20 million sleeve so that we can provide sort of a rebate and show that we can reward companies for making good on their impact. And what I've learned from it, one is that it's not easy to bring 23 stakeholders across a capital spectrum, from philanthropy to impact investors to development finance institutions to commercial banks. Shinhan, the biggest bank in Korea, is part of it. But equally important that we talk a lot about climate finance being scarce. But the truth is, last year the world invested $2 trillion in climate finance. $2 trillion in what people would call impact. Less than 800 million went into off-grid solar, despite the fact that we have one of the biggest planetary market failures in our lifetime. 600 million people with no electrification. And so what I feel proudest of, Sarah, is that we're able to have a model of what it looks like when people think about what they can offer, the right capital, the right entrepreneurial power, the right ideas, and come together to solve these problems that have seemed intractable for too long.
You know, yesterday some people here listened to Stefan Kroken, who was talking about how our market economies work, and that a fundamental design of it is that we kind of assume that price equals value. And I'm super curious of you who worked with people who are poor for quite a long time, because I think that a function of that this is how our markets tend to operate is that a lot of organizations over time tend to move towards more affluent segments because they can pay, even though they may not be the ones who are in highest need of the product with some other objective measures. But if you want to grow what you're doing, then those who can pay are those who get served to a larger extent. And I would love to
I wish I could talk to him, because I'm struggling with that concept.
Tell us more about those you've worked with. Like, how have you managed to stay serving the poor with?
Well, first of all, I think we have to stop talking about value so much and focus equally on values. who do we want to be as a human race? What do we value? And so it actually hasn't been that difficult for Acumen to stay focused on the people who've been overlooked and underestimated. Because by building a community of entrepreneurs and investors and philanthropists, I think we've had this opportunity to be on maybe the most exciting human journey possible, because we've gotten to go to parts of the world where people are used to not counting. And yet they are teaching us the new innovation. They are teaching us what could change. I was just with one of our entrepreneurs who runs a company called Crop to Cash in Nigeria. And it's a platform with about 500,000 smallholder farmers across Nigeria. And Michael was frustrated because the traditional extension workers, which are the government-employed workers that go visit the companies, haven't been very helpful to the farmers. And so he has been experimenting with an AI where the farmers can use a dumb phone. They don't need a smartphone. They call essentially a 1-800 number, and they can put their phone on their table at night and ask the AI any question they have in any one of 9 local languages. And on average, those farmers are talking to the AI 20 minutes a night, 7 days a week. He's seeing significant increases in productivity, and he's seeing much more coherence among the farmer community. I think that many of the problems that we have as a world will be solved by the innovators who are operating at the edges. And what I would love to explore is that if we're thinking about value, whatever price we would pay, which so often is connected to status, that we have a real opportunity to shift our definition of what success is and what status is. Because I think the superheroes of the world, especially the world that looks like ours, cannot just be those who have the highest status things. I think the real superpowers are the persons like Yi and other entrepreneurs who are taking on some of the toughest issues of our time. They are becoming profitable. They are scaling. But you probably haven't heard of most of them because they don't end up on the front pages of our magazines. And so I think that's the work of Acumen and Norrsken and others, that it's time that we define success not just by money, power, fame, but by the amount of human energy we release in the world and the amount of beauty we create for a world that needs more of it.
I think one thing I've reflected on, Jacqueline, following up on that, when I read your books as well, is that we all live in a context where we talk a lot about like solving problems and dealing with risks and so forth. And then I think that there are just so many things that you've experienced yourself in your life and the people you worked with that I've just felt when I hear about it that, wow, that is a very different, more profound level of like actual risk, of like people who've been through genocide, people trying to raise a family in a violent community, etc. Do you think that we here are a bit too comfortable, that we actually could be a lot bolder than we are, because the actual risks of failing are, we would still live a rather comfortable life? Or how do you think about that? What is it of what we're dealing with that is actually hard versus mostly imaginary hard?
I mean, I think we all have to ask ourselves that question. What I would say, Sarah, is I think too many of us are afraid to move. We're afraid to invest. We're afraid to try. We're afraid to put our neck out. And we keep asking ourselves, well, what's the cost of daring? I might fail. I might humiliate my family. I might get hurt. And as you said, some of the areas in which we operate have gotten more violent, not less violent, over these last 3 or 4 years. What I like to ask myself and our team is that it's too easy to ask ourselves what the cost of daring is. That too often makes you not dare. Instead, we should be asking ourselves, what's the cost of not daring? In the case of off-grid electrification, for instance, not daring, and I could cry because putting this whole thing together, it took so much, but the case of not doing it is more inequality, more emissions, because Africa's at a crossroads, and it will either electrify with fossil fuels or it will electrify with green energy. Off-grid solar is the fastest, cheapest, easiest way. So rising emissions, rising instability, and importantly, and what we forget in the West, is rising migration. That this is all of ours. And so I feel that we can solve for financial risk if we're smart enough and we're careful enough. But money shouldn't be the problem. It shouldn't be what holds us back from doing hard things. And if Jane Goodall just died yesterday, one of my great heroes, and crazily enough, on Thursday I was in a green room with her. And when you look at a 91-year-old like Jane, or Sylvia Earle and the work she's done with the oceans, or so many of these 80 and 90-year-old heroes, they're full of life and sparkle and possibility, not because they did easy things, but because they kept doing hard things. And I think that signing up to do really hard things makes the case for staying forever young, forever renewing, forever curious. And there are too many lonely people out there in the world. And I actually think we'd be a lot less lonely if we were collaborating with whatever we can bring to the party to solve those problems.
That was a fantastic wrap-up of this conversation. I'm hoping that we'll get to invite you here 15 years from now again, and we toast together of what a beautiful place the world actually is, and on the trajectory to become even better then. Thank you so much, Jacqueline.
Thanks. I would just say that I'm counting on it, but it won't happen unless we decide to make it that way.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.